Welcome to one of the most chilling stories in Maryland's history. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel and when people choose to listen to them. The name Clara Bell first surfaced in faded ink inside a leather-bound journal found in the basement of Tenney Manor, a crumbling Victorian estate hidden in the hills of Frederick County. The journal dates back to 1904, when America was leaving the Gilded Age behind. Yet inside those walls, time seemed frozen. The journal was unearthed in 1962 by a contractor renovating the long-abandoned property, and its discovery raised unsettling questions. According to every county record, no woman named Clara Bell was ever tied to the Tenney family or their estate. Yet her words paint a vivid picture of isolation, manipulation, and psychological torment that history has chosen to ignore. Built in 1872 by Roland Tenney, a wealthy investor in railroads and coal mining, the manor was a grand three-story structure crowned with a widow's walk visible from the road to Baltimore. Publicly, Roland was a respected man, but privately his life was a void. No marriage records, no children, no family photographs, nothing until Clara Bell's journal appeared decades after the Tenney name had vanished. In her first entry, Clara Bell wrote that she arrived at Tenney Manor in the spring of 1904 at age 22 under mysterious circumstances. "Mr. Tenney insists I call him father," she wrote, though we both know this is only for convenience. The housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, showed her to a room with painted shut windows. When she asked why, Mrs. Winters replied, "Mr. Tenney prefers it that way." By then, Roland was 67. County records later noted his death in 1919 from natural causes, but his fortune had already evaporated in the years before his passing. Only the manor remained. Clara Bell described the household as eerily empty, just herself, Mrs. Winters, and a mute groundskeeper named Thaddeus, who appeared only at dusk. Though the mansion had 18 rooms, she was allowed in only 7. The third floor was forbidden entirely. When she questioned this, Roland told her, "An heiress must learn patience. All will be yours in time." Yet no adoption papers or inheritance documents were ever found. In a 1963 interview, the daughter of the town physician said the Tenneys were notoriously private. She had never heard of anyone named Clara Bell connected to the family. The journal's tone grew darker as the months passed. Clara Bell described a rigid daily routine meant to isolate her breakfast alone at 7, reading to Mr. Tenney in the library by 8, a silent hour in the garden at noon, and then confinement to her room for the rest of the day. Dinner came at 6, and by 9, her door was locked from the outside. Gradually, her sense of reality began to erode. "He says I was rude to Mrs. Winters," she wrote. "I don't remember, but his certainty made me doubt my own mind." When she questioned a telegram's arrival, she was punished 3 days locked away, without food. Her letters to friends never received replies, and newspapers were censored before she could read them. By autumn, she began to note strange sounds, footsteps in the west wing, muffled voices at night, and someone watching from the third-floor window, even though Mrs. Winters swore that floor was empty. "Perhaps your imagination is too active," the housekeeper said coldly. "Mr. Tenney will be disappointed to hear of it." Why Roland Tenney brought Clara Bell to the manor and what became of her remains one of Frederick County's most haunting mysteries. Clara Bell's early writings hint that she came from humble beginnings, and her stay at Tenney Manor had been presented as a chance to rise in society. She occasionally mentioned the agreement, though she never revealed its full terms. By December 1904, her tone shifts something in her situation. No longer feels right. One entry reads, "Mr. Tenney had a visitor today, a Dr. Ambrose from Baltimore. They spoke privately for hours. When he left, I overheard him say, 'She appears suitable, though final confirmation will require more observation.' They stopped talking when they saw me. Mr. Teeny's eyes looked different, calculating, maybe even afraid. Historical records confirm that a Dr. Edward Ambrose practiced in Baltimore during that time, specializing in nervous disorders. Financial ledgers later revealed several large payments from Roland Teeny to Dr. Ambrose between 1904 and the following year. By early 1905, Clara Bell's role at the Manor seemed to change. She wrote about being measured for new dresses, photographed from several angles, and questioned by Roland about her ancestry and mental health. "I feel like livestock being prepared for sale," she noted bitterly. In February, while Mrs. Winters was distracted, Clara Bell slipped into Tenney's study and found letters between him and Dr. Ambrose dated years before she ever arrived. The correspondence discussed securing a suitable replacement and maintaining continuity of care. Then she discovered a legal document bearing her own signature, one she didn't remember signing, granting Tenney full guardianship and control over her medical decisions, supposedly due to nervous fragility. Another nearly identical document referenced a woman named Elizabeth, dated 1897. No record of an Elizabeth Tenney exists, but a brief Baltimore Sun article from that same year mentioned that Tenney had taken in his orphaned niece, Miss E. After that, the name disappeared from all public record. As months passed, Clara Bell's writings turned increasingly frantic. She described hearing whispers through the walls, finding her belongings rearranged and pages torn from her journal. One night she woke to see Mrs. Winters standing silently at the foot of her bed, only for the housekeeper to deny it the next morning. Clara Bell began mapping the manor in her journal, noting every hallway window and door. The east wing where she lived had 5 bedrooms, 4 sealed and covered in sheets. The west wing, partially forbidden, seemed to contain Roland's private quarters and at least one mysterious room she couldn't identify. In April 1905, she made a chilling observation. From outside, there should be a room between the study and library, yet inside there is none. No door, no sign of one ever existing. Where is this missing room, and what is it hiding? She measured the walls from the garden and became convinced that parts of the manor didn't align, entire sections seemed to exist only from the outside. Her fixation grew as she noticed more architectural discrepancies, windows that led to nowhere, uneven spacing on the west wing, and a third floor that seemed too large for the exterior. There must be rooms without windows, she wrote, rooms meant to keep something or someone hidden. By summer, her mental state was unraveling. Her handwriting became erratic, her entries disjointed. "I don't trust what I see," she wrote. "He says the garden wall was always brick, but I remember iron bars. She says we had beef for dinner, but I know it was chicken. They change things. They make me doubt myself. And always there are the sounds above the 3rd floor that no one admits exists." In July 1905, she recorded a rare encounter with an outsider. A delivery man from town whispered to her while Mrs. Winters wasn't watching. "Are you the new one?" he asked. When she pressed him, he added, "You look better than the last, more life in you still." Before she could ask anything else, Mrs. Winters returned and the man was dismissed. He never came back. A local newspaper later published a short item describing a delivery man's odd meeting with a young woman at a secluded estate near Frederick. The details matched Clara Bell's account almost exactly. By August, desperation overtook her. One night after the household went quiet, she decided to see the 3rd floor for herself. "I waited until midnight," she wrote. "The stairs groaned, so I took off my shoes and crept up one step at a time. The door was locked as I expected, but I had a hairpin from Mrs. Winters's room." What she found, or what happened next, was never fully written. The next few pages of the journal are missing. It took nearly 20 minutes, but the lock finally gave way, and whatever Clara Bell found beyond that door changed her forever. The next several pages were torn from the journal, leaving only silence where the truth should have been. When her writing resumed in September 1905, her tone was entirely different. Gone was the naive, frightened voice of a trapped young woman. What remained was guarded, fragmented, and coded as if she knew her words might be read by someone else. She began referring to the other and my predecessor without explanation, and repeatedly mentioned the necessity of escape before the transition. Though she never described what she saw that night, scattered fragments offer chilling clues. She wrote of a room of mirrors, where every surface, walls, floor, ceiling reflected endlessly. And beside the bed, a mechanism whose purpose is too terrible to imagine. She mentioned a portrait that cannot be a face, one that looked both like her and not like her, dressed in clothes she had been measured for, but never received. As the weeks passed, Clara Bell began describing strange physical symptoms, bruises on her wrists and throat, bouts of disorientation, and stretches of missing time. "I looked in the mirror this morning," she wrote, "and for an instant I did not know the woman staring back. Her eyes were mine, yet wrong. Her mouth moved before I spoke." That sense of unease built toward a shocking entry dated October 2nd, 1905. "Dr. Ambrose visited again," she wrote. "He examined me, my eyes pulse heartbeat. He asked about my dreams, whether I hear voices. Then he took out a pocket watch and swung it before me, asking if I felt tired. I pretended to be, but it didn't work. He seemed irritated. Later, I overheard him tell Mr. Tenney, 'She resists more than the others. We may need to consider direct methods.'" Others. What method? Unsealed medical files from Johns Hopkins Hospital decades later revealed a disturbing link. Dr. Edward Ambrose had indeed referred a patient named Elizabeth Tenney in 1899, diagnosed with personality dissolution and identity fragmentation following experimental treatment. Notes describe her as unresponsive, alternating between silence and violent agitation, claiming another self lived inside her. After 3 months, she was discharged into the care of her uncle Roland Tenney. No records exist beyond that point. By late October, Clara Bell's entries show careful preparation for escape. She observed that every Thursday, Mrs. Winters went to the root cellar and left the kitchen door unlocked for 12 minutes. She charted the route to the nearest neighbor, 1.8 miles to the east, and secretly dried bits of food to carry with her. But her hopes were interrupted by something far darker. In November, she wrote Mr. Tenney. "Mr. Tenney announced, 'We will host a gathering in December, the first since my arrival. He says it will introduce me to society, that I am to be the heiress of Tenney Manor.'" The way he said it chilled me. He told her she would wear a gown that once belonged to the previous mistress, a woman he described cryptically as "my wife" in all but legal form. Her next entries dissolve into confusion and fear. She attempted to flee through the garden, but was caught confined for 2 weeks, and began suspecting her meals were laced with drugs. Her thoughts grew erratic, sentences repeated, and paragraphs ended mid-word. When December came, she wrote of the promised gathering. 5 or 6 men, all older. They watched me as if I were merchandise. The gown fit perfectly, though I'd never tried it on before. Mr. Tenney gave a toast to continuation and preservation of what is most precious. Their eyes on me told me exactly what he meant. Local newspaper archives confirmed that a private dinner took place at Tenney Manor that month, attended by Baltimore and Washington businessmen. One brief line mentioned Mistress Tenney's ward, but gave no name, Clara Bell's only trace in public record. By January 1906, a final clarity appeared in her writing. "I see it now," she wrote. "The 3rd floor, Elizabeth. The preparations, it all fits. He isn't searching for an heiress. He's searching for a vessel. Elizabeth was the first. I am to be next. The process demands surrender. I will not give it." Days later, she discovered a hidden diary behind a false panel in the library, Elizabeth's own. Its pages mirrored her own experiences, isolation, manipulation, and experiments of a mental and spiritual kind. The final entry ended mid-sentence, but in the margin, a different hand had written, "The process continues. E. Proved unsuitable. The next vessel must be more compliant." The last dated entry in Clara Bell's journal, February 12, 1906, records a single conversation that changes everything. Mrs. Winters came not to watch, but to warn. "You must pretend to yield," she whispered. "It's the only way. Elizabeth fought and is now neither here nor gone. There are worse fates than death. Keep something of yourself hidden." After that, the journal ends abruptly. No record exists of Clara Bell's fate. The manor stood empty again within the year. Clara Bell's final coherent entry reads like a farewell. "She left before I could question her further, but left behind a small key she claims will open the rear gate. I plan to leave tonight, though I fear what might follow me from this place." After that, her writing dissolves into chaos, fragmented thoughts, bizarre sketches of hallways and staircases, and repeated lines scrawled across the pages. The walls have ears. She watches from my eyes. The last page, written in a frantic, looping hand, bears only one phrase. She is coming through, repeated, until the ink bleeds into the paper and trails off the edge. What became of Clara Bell after February 1906 remains a mystery. There's no death certificate, no burial record, no trace of her departure from Tenney Manor. In fact, official documents don't confirm her existence at all. The Tenney family's influence in Frederick County likely kept prying eyes away, and Roland Tenney's wealth was more than enough to buy silence. Yet public records show that something changed in Roland that spring. Once a recluse, he began appearing at social functions and making generous donations to women's education funds, causes he had never shown interest in before. Then, in the April 17, 1906 edition of the Frederick News Society pages, reported that Mr. Roland Tenney and his ward Miss Clara attended the governor's spring ball in Annapolis. It described her as poised, articulate, and remarkably knowledgeable about railroad history, a topic deeply familiar to Roland, but according to her own journal, foreign to Clara Bell. It's the only public mention of a Miss Clara connected to Tenney Manor. By summer church records from St. John's Episcopal in Frederick, list Mr. Tenney and Miss Clara Tenney as regular attendees. Reverend Samuel Wilson later recalled that the young woman spoke with the manner and wisdom of one far older and seemed strangely familiar with the congregation, as if she remembered people she had never met. He also noted that her handwriting in the guest book changed over time from a youthful, hesitant scrawl to a firm, elegant style nearly identical to Roland's own. Mrs. Winters, the longtime housekeeper, vanished from record after 1906. By the 1910 census, Tenney Manor housed only Roland and a new servant, Margaret Doyle. The mute groundskeeper, Thaddeus, stayed on for a few more years before leaving for Pittsburgh in 1912. Police reports from that city in 1914 mention a Thaddeus Winters likely related to the housekeeper, arrested for public intoxication. The arresting officer noted that he was raving about a young woman being hollowed out and filled with something else. When questioned, he spoke of rituals with mirrors and blood performed by the doctor and the old man. He paid his fine and disappeared from history. Dr. Edward Ambrose, meanwhile, retired from medicine in 1915 to pursue private research. Property deeds show he purchased an estate less than 5 miles from Tenney Manor that same year. His 1927 death certificate lists suicide by poisoning, though no investigation followed. When a distant relative donated his journals to the Maryland Medical Historical Society in 1968, researchers found unsettling references to the Tenney case and the succession challenge. One entry from October 1905 reads, "Subject C shows remarkable resistance to the transition process. Unlike Subject E, she maintains mental boundaries under deep hypnosis. R is concerned, but I believe her strength may serve us better. The stronger the vessel, the more complete the transfer. Another, dated March 1906, is even more chilling. Success at last. The integration appears complete. Subject C's original personality has been suppressed. The transferred consciousness remains stable. R is satisfied, though I advise caution during public interactions. Roland Tenney lived another 13 years. When he died in 1919, his will specified that Tenney Manor would pass only to blood relatives, though none ever came forward. The estate sat empty until 1962, when a development company purchased it for renovation. During demolition work in the old pantry, a carpenter found a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a small leather-bound journal wrapped in decayed linen, the writings of Clara Bell. The developer, Martin Collins, became consumed by the story. His partner later recalled that Collins began staying overnight at the abandoned manor, convinced he heard movement upstairs and saw reflections that didn't belong to him. After 3 months, he abruptly quit the project, sold his share of the company, and left Frederick County for good. No one ever bought Tenney Manor again. According to William Stein, before leaving Frederick County for good, Martin Collins confessed something that still unsettles anyone who's heard it. "Something is still there," he said. "Still waiting. It watched me through the mirrors. Sometimes I could almost see her face instead of mine." Not long after, his mind began to unravel in ways eerily similar to Clara Bell's own descent a half-century earlier. In early 1963, Collins was admitted to Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Baltimore, diagnosed with severe paranoia and dissociative identity symptoms. Court-released portions of his medical file revealed that he told doctors repeatedly, "I'm becoming her. She's coming through." He died 2 years later of what was officially listed as heart failure, though a nurse's note mentions unexplained bruises around his throat. Dr. Lawrence Friedman, the psychiatrist who treated Collins later, described him anonymously in a 1969 medical journal article. The patient, he wrote, had developed an obsessive identification with a historical figure after reading that person's writings. His voice, handwriting, and even his knowledge shifted to match hers despite no prior exposure. He insisted, Friedman wrote, that something was replacing him from within a consciousness that had waited decades for a new vessel. Tenney Manor itself met its end not long after. The decaying estate was demolished in 1968, following 3 failed renovation attempts, each plagued by mysterious accidents, electrical malfunctions, and sudden cold zones that caused workers to abandon the project. The land sat empty until 1978, when it was purchased by the county and turned into a public park. Visitors to what is now Tenney Park often report an uncanny sensation of being watched near the surviving foundation stones. Park Ranger Matthew Davis told a local newspaper in 1985 that he'd found people standing motionless near the eastern ruins, as if listening to voices only they could hear. On at least 3 occasions, he had to escort visitors out after they became disoriented, claiming someone named Elizabeth or Clara was speaking to them. In 1992, historian Dr. Rebecca Morrison attempted to uncover more about the Tenney family and the woman behind the journal. Her research led her to a nursing home in western Maryland, where she met Margaret Penn, great-niece of Margaret Doyle, the housekeeper, who succeeded Mrs. Winters at Tenney Manor. Penn remembered her aunt speaking of her time there only once. There were 2 voices from those rooms, she said. He called her Clara when she could hear him, but Elizabeth when she couldn't. The worst was when her voice changed deep or older, and she'd answer to either name. That's when my aunt knew she had to leave. Penn also produced a small gold locket that had belonged to her great-aunt. Inside was a photograph dated 1907, showing a young woman in a high-collared Victorian gown, outdated even for its time. The subject's expression was composed, almost serene, but her eyes seemed far older than her face, holding an awareness that Dr. Morrison later described as centuries deep. While reviewing financial ledgers, Morrison found another disturbing detail. regular payments from Roland Tenney's estate to a private sanitarium in western Maryland, beginning in 1898 and continuing until his death. The institution later closed in 1932, specialized in treating patients with severe identity and memory disorders. Fragmentary case notes mention a woman admitted under the initials E.T., diagnosed with physical deterioration following partial consciousness transfer procedure. The patient reportedly spent years in a near catatonic state, occasionally becoming lucid enough to whisper, "I'm only partly here. Most of me is still in the Manor." But the most shocking discovery came decades later. In 2003, renovations at the Baltimore County Hall of Records unearthed a sealed file labeled Taney Estate, Confidential 1906. Inside was a photograph dated June 1906. Roland Taney standing beside a young woman identified as Clara Bell Taney. Her face, half-shadowed, bore little resemblance to Clara Bell's descriptions of herself in the journal. Scrawled in fading ink along the photo's edge were 4 haunting words. Third attempt, successful. The file also contained a letter from Dr. O. Ambrose to Roland, dated March 1906. It read in part, "The continuation process has been refined with each subject. Elizabeth, our first, achieved partial success, but fragmented. The second subject rejected the process entirely, resulting in catastrophic failure. Clara, however, demonstrates near-perfect integration. Your consciousness now resides primarily within the new vessel, though remnants of the host may persist. Continued reinforcement is essential." If authentic, the letter confirms a horrifying theory that Roland Taney's experiments were not simply acts of cruelty or madness, but deliberate attempts to cheat death by transferring his consciousness into another human being. Clara Bell was never meant to inherit his estate. She was meant to become him. Her sudden mastery of his knowledge, her altered handwriting, her presence beside him at public functions all may have been signs that the transfer had succeeded. Whether Clara Bell was a victim of psychological manipulation, a tragic sufferer of mental illness, or the unwilling subject of a grotesque attempt at immortality, we may never know. But the evidence, her journal, the photographs, the medical files, suggests something far stranger than madness. Whatever happened behind the locked door on Tenney Manor's 3rd floor did not end there. And perhaps, as Collins once warned, it never really left. What we know for certain is that after February 1906, the Clara Bell who wrote the journal, who dreamed of escape and feared what might follow her, vanished in every sense that matters. Whether someone else emerged in her place wearing her face and name remains one of the most chilling questions in Maryland's history. Today, Clara Bell's journal is housed in the special collections of the Maryland Historical Society in Baltimore. According to curator Dr. James Whitmore, researchers who study it often report an uncanny sense of being watched. Some abandon their work entirely, claiming to experience dreams of being trapped behind their own eyes, unable to move, while something else looks out through them. In 1997, a graduate student named Jennifer Keller spent several weeks studying the Tenney family and Clara Bell's writings for her thesis. Her advisor, Dr. Michael Thornton, later said her behavior changed as the research progressed. Her speech became formal and archaic. Her writing took on an old-fashioned tone, and she began referring to events from the early 1900s as if she'd lived them. She became obsessed with mirrors, he recalled. She'd stop mid-sentence to stare at her reflection as if trying to recognize herself. 3 months into the project, Keller abruptly withdrew from her program. In her withdrawal letter, she wrote, "I can no longer trust that my thoughts are entirely my own. Something came back with me from those pages, something old and patient and hungry. Sometimes I wake to find my hands writing words I did not choose in a hand that is not mine." Keller changed her name, moved to Oregon, and has never spoken publicly since. Equally unsettling is the final note left by historian Dr. Rebecca Morrison, before she abandoned her research in 1993. "I visited Tenny Park at dusk," she wrote. "Standing on the old foundation stones of the east wing, I looked up where the third floor would have been. For a moment I saw windows that shouldn't exist, and behind them, a pale face watching. It wasn't Clara or Elizabeth. It was something else, something that had consumed them both and still hungers for more." Years later, in 2007, a Johns Hopkins architecture student attempted to reconstruct Tenny Manor's original layout using county blueprints and early photographs. Her findings were deeply disturbing. Nearly 20% of the structure's interior space was missing from the official plans. "It's as if the house was built with rooms inside the walls," she wrote. Most troubling was the third-floor photographs, clearly showed 4 windows, yet the blueprints listed only 2 rooms. "The remaining space doesn't exist on paper," she concluded. When she visited Tenny Park herself, she reported a profound sense of being watched. "I felt eyes above me," she wrote from a vantage point that no longer physically exists. "It knew what I was thinking." After completing her thesis, she asked for her name to be removed from all records and destroyed her materials before leaving the university. In 2014, a paranormal research group conducted an overnight investigation at Tenny Park. Their recordings captured whispers they claimed said, "Not enough room for both," and "the vessel rejects." On one tape, a female voice was distinctly heard saying, "He still waits inside me." Most dismissed the evidence as pareidolia and environmental interference. But then in 2018, something tangible was unearthed. After a violent storm uprooted an oak tree near the eastern foundation, workers discovered a small metal box buried among the roots. Inside were surgical tools from the early 1900s, several vials of unidentified chemicals, and a notebook written in a neat, deliberate hand. The transfer process requires 3 elements: the willing vessel, the consciousness to be transferred, and the catalyst. The catalyst remains stable. We have sufficient supply for 2 more attempts should this one fail. RT believes the current subject ideal isolated, malleable, and of sound constitution. Preparation continues. The Maryland State Police took possession of the items, but no legal action followed. The objects now rest in the Frederick County Historical Society archives, tagged only as artifacts of unknown provenance, possibly related to Tenny Estate. Perhaps the most haunting testimony came from James Wilson, a caretaker who worked at Tenny Park between 1983 and 2001. "There's one spot near where the east wing used to stand where nothing electrical works right," he said in a 2019 oral history. "Flashlights die. Watches stop, even car batteries, if you park too close. It comes and goes, days of nothing, then sudden surges." But it wasn't just the strange energy that unsettled him. It was the people. Every few years, a woman would start visiting the ruins. Always alone, always drawn to the same spot. They'd sit there for hours with old books or photos, sometimes lighting candles. Then they'd disappear. The ones I did see again, they weren't the same. They spoke differently, older somehow. One of them looked me dead in the eye once and said, "He's almost ready for another." The vessel wears out eventually. Then she walked away, and I never saw her again. The story of Clara Bell and Tenny Manor endures as one of Maryland's darkest mysteries, a tale of identity possession and the fragile boundary between the mind and whatever waits beyond it. The journal's final words. "She is coming through, linger like a curse, a warning that some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Local folklore now warns that anyone who spends too long studying Tenny Manor or the story of Clara Bell risks attracting the attention of whatever still lingers there. The signs, locals say, are subtle at first, a growing fixation on one's reflection, shifts in handwriting, sudden knowledge of historical details never studied, and dreams of wandering a house with endless halls and locked doors that never quite stay shut. In 2021, a documentary filmmaker began a project about Clara Bell and Tinny Manor, interviewing historians, paranormal investigators, and residents of Frederick County. 3 months into production, the project was suddenly canceled. The filmmaker cited only personal reasons, but a production assistant later claimed she had changed during filming, paranoid, constantly checking mirrors, sometimes speaking in a voice that wasn't hers. The assistant said she became convinced an elderly man in outdated clothing was following her, always at a distance, vanishing when approached. Most disturbing of all, she reportedly began waking in the night to find herself writing in a journal she didn't remember buying in handwriting that wasn't her own. Before disappearing overseas, she burned the journal. Today you can still visit Tenny Park at the end of Old Manor Road. Locals advise against going after sunset, especially near the eastern ruins, where the foundation stones still rise from the soil. On windless nights, the air there feels heavy, as if something beneath the earth is stirring. Some say that if you stand too long in the quiet, you might hear faint breathing or see your reflection in the darkened glass of the old information sign watching you back. The original Clara Bell journal remains locked in the restricted archives of the Maryland Historical Society. Viewing it requires special permission, and few are granted access. Current curator Dr. Eliza Montgomery has said that's as much for the researcher's safety as for preservation. In a private letter leaked online in 2022, she described something deeply unsettling. "We've been digitizing the collection, including the Clara Bell journal," she wrote. But certain pages never photograph the same way twice. Text that was clear one day appears blurred or altered the next. Most disturbing is the final page. "She is coming through," where the handwriting itself changes between captures, as if the writer is still in the act of becoming. The Frederick County Historical Society now features a small exhibit on Tenny Manor. Behind the glass are faded photographs, censored excerpts of Clara Bell's writings, and objects recovered from the ruins. Visitors frequently report a sudden drop in temperature near the display. Some claim that for an instant, their reflection in the glass doesn't match their movement, that someone else, faint but distinct, is looking out from behind their face. At Mount Olivet Cemetery, where Roland Tinny was buried, fresh white lilies are often found arranged in a perfect circle on his grave, though he has no known descendants. When asked, longtime groundskeeper Thomas Reed simply says, "Some debts don't expire, some promises don't end." Since the journal's discovery in 1962, at least 7 researchers have abandoned their work on the case, each describing symptoms eerily similar to Clara Bell's final months' confusion at their own reflection, lapses in memory, the feeling of someone else looking through my eyes. Psychologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell suggests a rational explanation, what she calls a sympathetic identity response, brought on by deep exposure to narratives of psychological manipulation. The human mind, she explains, is vulnerable to stories about the loss of self. Yet even she admits the consistency of these cases, handwriting changes, mirror fixation. The sense of being replaced defies coincidence. In 2003, a privately funded radar survey of Tenny Park uncovered anomalous structures buried 8 feet below the East Foundation spaces not shown on any blueprints. Excavation was halted almost immediately after unusual technical issues and rising staff anxiety. The area remains cordoned off. So the legend of Tenny Manor ends not with resolution, but with echoes. Who was Elizabeth? What became of Clara Bell? And what exactly did Roland Tinny create behind those sealed doors? Perhaps some truths are better left unknown. Perhaps knowledge itself is the invitation, the doorway. And maybe, just maybe, something still waits on the other side, patient and watchful, behind the eyes of whoever dares to look too long. For those drawn to seek answers, remember this: if your handwriting changes, if your reflection hesitates, Or if you find yourself dreaming of rooms that don't exist, stop. Close the book. Step away before curiosity becomes a summons. Because some doors once opened will never close again, as Clara Bell herself wrote before she disappeared. Knowledge itself is a vessel. To learn his secrets is to create a path between us. Even now I feel him watching through my eyes, waiting for the moment. My guard falters, and the door opens completely. Perhaps the kindest mercy would be to forget her, to let the name Clara Bell fade. But as long as her journal endures, as long as the stones of Tenny Manor remain beneath the soil, someone will always be drawn to them. And something will always be waiting patient, ancient, and hungry for a new vessel.